The morning Richard Martinez found his father's wheelchair ramp demolished, the sky was a perfect mocking blue. He'd been expecting trouble from the Sycamore Estates Homeowners Association for weeks, snippy letters, threatening phone calls, even a personal visit from Diane Keller, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of property values, but nothing had prepared him for this. What the hell? Richard stood in his driveway, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, staring at the splintered wood and twisted metal that had, just yesterday, been the carefully constructed ramp he built for his 78-year-old father, Eduardo. The remains had been unceremoniously piled at the edge of his lawn like discarded trash. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his sister Carmen, "On my way over with Dad, ETA 10 minutes. Richard's stomach dropped. His father had been staying with Carmen for the weekend while Richard installed new grab bars in the bathroom. How was he supposed to get his father, who had lost his left leg to diabetes last year, into the house now? The sound of a car door slamming turned Richard's attention to the house across the street where Diane Keller was emerging from her immaculate white SUV. She wore her trademark crisp pantsuit and a self-satisfied smile that made Richard's blood boil. "Morning, Richard," she called as if they were old friends meeting at a neighborhood barbecue. "I see the violation has been addressed." Richard took a deep breath, set his coffee mug on the hood of his car, and crossed the street. At 52, he'd spent his adult life as a construction foreman, managing difficult people and challenging situations. He'd always prided himself on keeping his cool, but this was testing every ounce of restraint he possessed. "You did this." His voice was dangerously quiet. Diane's smile tightened. "The Architectural Review Committee found your addition to be in violation of community standards. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws clearly states." "That was my father's wheelchair ramp," Richard cut in. "He's coming home today. How exactly is he supposed to get into the house?" "That's not the HOA's concern," Diane said, her voice clipped. "The bylaws exist for a reason. You never submitted the proper paperwork for approval. The structure was unsightly and reduced curb appeal. Do you have any idea what that does to property values?" Before Richard could respond, a car pulled into his driveway. Carmen was early. He watched as she helped their father out of the passenger seat and into his wheelchair. Eduardo Martinez had once been a powerful man, a master carpenter who had built half the custom cabinets in town. Now he looked diminished, but his eyes were alert as they took in the pile of broken lumber. "That's my ramp," Eduardo said, his voice carrying across the yard. Richard hurried back across the street. "Dad, I'm sorry." "Who did this?" Eduardo demanded, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. Carmen put a hand on her father's shoulder. "What happened, Rich?" she asked, but her eyes were already fixed on Diane, who was still standing on her pristine lawn, arms crossed. "The HOA happened," Richard said. Eduardo wheeled himself forward, stopping at the edge of the driveway. "You," he called to Diane. "Come here." For a moment, Diane looked uncertain, but then she crossed the street, straightening her jacket as she approached. "Mr. Martinez, I presume," she said coolly. "I understand you're upset, but your son failed to follow proper procedures. The ramp was an unauthorized modification that. I built houses in this town when we were still in diapers," Eduardo interrupted, his accent thickening with anger. "That ramp was solid. It was safe. Now tell me, young lady, how am I supposed to get into my son's house?" A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Richard noticed Mr. Patel from next door filming with his phone. On the other side, the Wilsons were watching from their porch, whispering to each other. Diane glanced around, seemingly aware that she was losing the battle of public opinion. "There are proper channels for accommodations," she said. "Your son should have filed the appropriate paperwork." "I did," Richard said quietly. 3 times, you denied every request." A car pulled up to the curb and a young woman stepped out, press badge visible on her lanyard. The local news had somehow already gotten wind of the situation. Looking at his father's dignified anger, his sister's protective stance, and the growing crowd of witnesses, Richard made a decision. This wasn't just about a ramp anymore. This was about dignity, about family, and about standing up to petty tyranny. "This ends today," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I promise you, Dad, when we're done, you'll have the best damn ramp in the entire city." By nightfall, the video of Eduardo Martinez sitting helplessly in his wheelchair at the bottom of his son's steps had been viewed over 50,000 times. The hashtag Justice for Eduardo was trending locally, with residents from neighboring communities sharing their own HOA horror stories. Richard sat at his kitchen table, phone buzzing constantly with notifications, as Carmen helped their father settle into the makeshift bedroom they created in the living room. "I'm sorry about all this, Pappy," Richard said, watching as Eduardo winced while shifting from his wheelchair to the hospital bed they'd rented after the incident. Getting him into the house had required Richard and 2 neighbors to physically carry him up the steps, a humiliating experience for a proud man who had spent his life building things with his hands. "Not your fault, Mio," Eduardo replied, his weathered face softening. "Some people get a little power and forget their humanity." He gestured toward the window where, across the street, Diane Keller's house remained brightly lit despite the late hour. Through the blinds, they could see shadows moving back and forth, the emergency HOA board meeting that had been hastily convened after the news crew aired their story on the evening broadcast. The doorbell rang, and Carmen went to answer it. She returned with Mia Chen, a young attorney who lived 3 doors down. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mia said, setting her laptop bag on the table. "But after what happened today, I thought you might need some help." Richard had exchanged pleasantries with Mia at neighborhood barbecues, but had never really gotten to know her. Now he noticed the determination in her eyes as she pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been looking for a way to challenge the HOA's overreach for months," she explained. "When they cited me for having a vegetable garden in my backyard last summer, I started researching. What they did today isn't just morally wrong, it's legally questionable." "How so?" Carmen asked, joining them at the table. "The Fair Housing Act," Mia said, pulling up a document on her laptop. "It prohibits discrimination based on disability, and that includes requiring reasonable modifications to dwellings. The HOA can regulate aesthetics, but they can't prevent accessibility accommodations, especially when they're necessary for a resident to use and enjoy their dwelling." "I told them that," Richard said, frustration evident in his voice. "I filled out every form they asked for. Diane just kept claiming it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic." "That's where they messed up," Maya replied, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "They can require that modifications be done in a way that minimizes impact on appearance, but they can't outright deny them. And destroying an existing accommodation, that opens them up to serious liability." The phone rang, and Richard excused himself to answer it. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression had changed. "That was Mark Williams from City Council," he said, the first glimmer of hope evident in his voice. "Apparently, his mother uses a wheelchair too. He saw the news and wants to meet with us tomorrow morning." "The city's getting involved?" Eduardo asked, perking up from his bed. "It gets better," Richard continued. "He's bringing the head of the building department and the city's ADA compliance officer. He says what happened here might highlight the need for broader changes to how the city handles accessibility issues." Carmen's phone chimed with a text message. "It's Mr. Patel from next door," she said, reading the screen. "He says there's a small group of neighbors gathering at his house right now. They want to help." As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Sarah Wilson from across the street, arms laden with casserole dishes. "The neighbor had wanted to make sure you all had some food," she said, stepping inside. "And Tommy, the college kid from the corner house, is an engineering student. He's already sketching designs for a new ramp that would satisfy both the building code and even Diane's precious aesthetic concerns." Behind her, a steady stream of neighbors began to arrive, some bringing food, others tools and measuring tapes. Within an hour, the living room had transformed into an impromptu command center, with Mia explaining legal strategy in one corner while Tommy unfurled blueprint paper across the dining room table, surrounded by a group of interested neighbors offering suggestions. Richard stood back, watching in amazement as the community he lived in for 15 years but barely knew came together. He caught his father's eye across the room and saw the old man smiling, his earlier humiliation replaced by something like pride. "You see, Mio," Eduardo said quietly when Richard approached, "this is how real neighborhoods work. Not with rules and threats, but with hearts and hands." Outside, more cars were pulling up, and Richard could see local news vans returning, drawn by the growing crowd. Through the window, he noticed Diane Keller standing on her porch, watching the activity with a mixture of confusion and alarm. For the first time since discovering the demolished ramp that morning, Richard smiled. Tomorrow would bring meetings with city officials and likely a confrontation with the HOA board. But tonight, looking around at the neighbors who had become allies in the span of a few hours, he knew they had already won something more valuable than any legal battle. "We're not just building you a new ramp, Dad," he said, squeezing Eduardo's shoulder. "I think we're rebuilding this entire community." The meeting room at City Hall was packed to capacity. Richard sat at the front table with Eduardo beside him in his wheelchair, Carmen and Mia Chen flanking them like sentries. Across from them, Diane Keller and 3 other HOA board members fidgeted uncomfortably under the glare of camera lights from local news stations. Mark Williams, the sympathetic city councilman, called the meeting to order with a sharp rap on his gavel. "I think we all know why we're here," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "What happened to Mr. Martinez is not just a neighborhood dispute. It's a matter that touches on civil rights, dignity, and how we as a community treat our most vulnerable citizens." Diane Keller leaned forward to the microphone. "With all due respect, Councilman, this is an internal HOA matter. The Sycamore Estates covenant clearly states, Miss Keller, interrupted Sophia Reyes, the city's ADA compliance officer, a no-nonsense woman with steel-rimmed glasses and a stack of documents before her. No HOA covenant supersedes federal law. The Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act both have specific provisions regarding reasonable accommodations. We never refused a reasonable accommodation, Diane insisted. We simply required proper channels and aesthetically appropriate solutions, which Mr. Martinez's son ignored. At this, Eduardo wheeled himself forward slightly. "May I speak?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. As all eyes turned to him, Eduardo Martinez straightened in his wheelchair. At 78, he still commanded respect, his callous hands resting lightly on the armrests, his eyes clear and direct. "I built my first house in this city when I was 22 years old," he began. "For 50 years, I worked with these hands, building homes for families across 3 counties. I paid my taxes. I followed the rules. I never asked for special treatment." He paused, looking directly at Diane. "All I wanted was a way to enter my son's home with dignity. Is that really too much to ask?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard noticed several HOA board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "The city's position is clear," Mark Williams said into the momentary silence. "What happened was unacceptable. But rather than dwelling on blame, I'd like to propose a solution." He nodded to a man sitting to his right who stood and introduced himself as Ben O'Malley, director of the building department. "We've reviewed the circumstances and consulted with our legal team," O'Malley said. "The city is prepared to issue an emergency permit for a new accessibility ramp at the Martinez residence with fees waived." A ripple of approval went through the crowd, but Diane Keller was not finished. "That still doesn't address the covenant violations. The HOA has authority over exterior modifications, and our members have paid good money to maintain certain community standards." "Actually," Mia Chen spoke up, opening a folder, "I've taken the liberty of reviewing your HOA bylaws in detail. Section 12, which you've conveniently overlooked, specifically states that accommodations for residents with disabilities must be considered in good faith and cannot be unreasonably denied." She slid copies of the document across the table. "The 3 consecutive denials with no constructive feedback constitute a clear violation of your own rules." Tommy Nguyen, the engineering student who had been sketching ramp designs the previous evening, raised his hand from the audience. When acknowledged, he approached the front of the roll of blueprints. "If I may," he said, unrolling the plans on the table, "I've designed an accessibility ramp that not only meets ADA requirements but also incorporates design elements that match the neighborhood aesthetic." The blueprints reveal an elegant solution, gently sloping pathway with integrated planters and materials that complemented the house's existing architecture. It was, Richard had to admit, far superior to his own hastily constructed wooden ramp. "This is the compromise I'm proposing," Councilman Williams said. "The city will expedite permits and waive fees. Mr. Nguyen has volunteered his design. And," he paused for effect, "I've spoken with several local contractors who are willing to donate materials and labor as part of our new Accessible Sycamore initiative." The room erupted in applause. Richard felt Carmen squeeze his arm in excitement. "What's more," Williams continued once the noise died down, "this incident has highlighted a gap in our city's approach to accessibility. I'm proposing a new ordinance that would streamline the permit process for all accessibility modifications and establish clear guidelines for HOAs throughout the city." Diane Keller's face had turned and mottled red. "This is government overreach," she protested. "The HOA has legal standing." "Perhaps we should put it to a vote," suggested an older man from the HOA board who had been silent until now. He turned to face Diane. "The optics of this situation are unfortunate. Fighting this will only damage property values far more than any ramp ever could." Before Diane could respond, the back doors of the meeting room swung open. A crowd of Sycamore Estates residents filed in, led by Mr. Patel and Sarah Wilson. Many carried handmade signs with slogans like "Neighbors help neighbors" and "Accessibility is a right." "We've collected signatures," Mr. Patel announced, holding up a thick stack of papers. "Over 80% of Sycamore Estates homeowners support Mr. Martinez and want reform of HOA practices." Diane Keller looked around the room, suddenly aware of how isolated her position had become. The other board members were already whispering among themselves, clearly calculating the political cost of continuing to fight. Eduardo reached across the table, his weathered hand extended toward Diane. "Ms. Keller," he said, his voice gentle now, "in my country we have a saying. It's better to build a longer table than a higher fence. Perhaps it is time we all sat at the same table." For a long moment, the room held its breath. Then, with a visible deflation of her rigid posture, Diane Keller reached out and briefly shook Eduardo's hand. "The HOA will cooperate with the city's initiative," she said stiffly. As the meeting adjourned amid cheers and congratulations, Richard found himself surrounded by neighbors offering help and support. Over their shoulders, he caught sight of his father deep in conversation with Tommy Nguyen, the old carpenter's hands moving animatedly as he made suggestions on the ramp design. "You know what this means, don't you?" Carmen said, appearing at his side. Richard nodded, watching his father come alive in a way he hadn't seen since before the amputation. "It means Dad's going to be supervising this project whether they want him to or not. And it means we won," Carmen added with a smile. Richard wasn't so sure. As he watched Diane Keller slip out a side door, her face a mask of rigid control, he suspected the battle wasn't entirely over. They had city support, community backing, and the moral high ground. But people like Diane rarely surrendered so easily. "Maybe," he said cautiously. "But let's see what happens when the actual building starts." The Saturday morning scheduled for construction began with an unexpected sight, a fleet of trucks and vans lining Magnolia Drive. Richard stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching in amazement as people he'd never met unloaded tools, lumber, and concrete mixers onto his front lawn. "Your father is quite the local celebrity," Carmen observed, joining him with her own steaming mug. "Half these people aren't even from our neighborhood." It was true. What had started as a community effort had ballooned into something much larger. After the city council meeting 3 days ago, local news stations had picked up the story. A prominent disability rights organization had shared Eduardo's story on social media, and by Friday afternoon, Richard had received calls from 3 separate construction companies offering materials and expertise. "Speaking of Dad," Richard said, "where is he?" Carmen nodded toward the driveway where Eduardo had wheeled himself beside Tommy Nguyen's car. The young engineering student was unrolling blueprints on the hood while Eduardo pointed and made suggestions, his face animated with the joy of being involved in a building project again. "He was up at 5 this morning," Carmen said, smiling. "I haven't seen him this energized in years." The scene was almost festive. Sarah Wilson and several other neighbors had set up a refreshment station under a pop-up tent. Children rode bikes and played tag in the closed-off street. Even Mr. Reynolds, the curmudgeonly retiree from the end of the block who rarely left his house, had brought out folding chairs and was arranging them in the shade. The only conspicuous absence was any sign of Diane Keller or the other HOA board members. Ben O'Malley from the building department arrived, clipboard in hand, and sought out Richard. "Just making it official," he said, presenting a permit. "Fastest approval in department history, I might add." "We appreciate it," Richard said, scanning the document. "Any word from the HOA?" O'Malley's expression tightened slightly. "Officially, they've withdrawn all objections." "Unofficially," he shrugged. "Miss Keller has been making some calls to my superiors. Nothing that will cause problems, but just be aware, she's not happy about any of this." Before Richard could respond, a truck from Rodriguez Construction pulled up. Miguel Rodriguez, owner of the largest construction company in the county and Eduardo's former apprentice, stepped out and made a beeline for the elder Martinez. "Maestro," he called, embracing Eduardo with careful enthusiasm. "When I heard what happened, I couldn't believe it. The man who taught me everything I know about building treated this way." Eduardo beamed, clasping Miguel's hand. "You didn't need to come yourself, Mejijo. You're too important now for such small jobs." "Small?" Miguel laughed. "This is the most important project I'll work on all year, and wait until you see what I brought." He signaled to his crew, who began unloading premium hardwood, custom metal railings, and materials Richard recognized as far superior to what they had planned to use. The volunteer workforce organized quickly. Under Tommy's direction, teams began marking the layout, digging foundation points, and measuring cuts. Eduardo held court from his wheelchair, inspecting every detail and offering advice that the workers, many of them seasoned professionals, accepted with deferential nods. Around mid-morning, Councilman Williams arrived with a small entourage, including a photographer from the local paper. "Hope you don't mind the publicity," he said to Richard after the obligatory handshakes and photos. "The Accessible Sycamore initiative is gaining traction. We've already had inquiries from 3 other neighborhoods about implementing similar programs." "No complaints here," Richard replied. "The more attention on accessibility issues, the better." As they talked, Richard noticed a familiar white SUV cruising slowly past the house. Diane Keller, sunglasses masking her eyes, made no attempt to stop or acknowledge the activity. But the deliberate pace of her vehicle and the way she craned her neck to observe the construction left little doubt about her interest. "Your HOA president still seems concerned about property values," Williams remarked, following Richard's gaze. "She'll have a hard time arguing this is decreasing them," Richard replied, gesturing toward the high-quality materials and professional installation underway. "This ramp will probably be the nicest feature on the block when it's done." By early afternoon, the concrete foundation had been poured, the main support structure assembled, and the framework of the ramp was taking shape. What would have normally been a multi-day project was progressing at remarkable speed with so many skilled hands involved. Carmen had been documenting everything with her camera, pausing occasionally to help Eduardo move to different vantage points. She approached Richard with her phone held out. "You need to see this," she said. It was a social media post from the local accessibility advocacy group, showing before and after photos of the demolished original ramp and today's construction progress. The caption read, "When bureaucracy tears down accessibility, community builds it back stronger. Hashtag justice for Eduardo, hashtag accessible Sycamore." It's been shared over 10,000 times already, Carmen said. People are adding their own HOA nightmare stories in the comments. As they were looking at the posts, a commotion near the street drew their attention. 2 police cars had pulled up and officers were approaching the construction site. Richard felt a chill of apprehension, immediately suspecting Diane Keller's involvement. The lead officer, a tall woman with a stern expression, made her way directly to Richard. "Mr. Martinez, I'm Officer Ramirez. We received a complaint about unauthorized construction and traffic obstruction." Before Richard could respond, Councilman Williams stepped forward, permit in hand. "Everything here is fully authorized by the city officer. I can vouch for that personally." Officer Ramirez reviewed the paperwork, then nodded. "That addresses the construction issue. As for the street closure, that would be covered by this," Ben O'Malley interjected, producing another document. "Temporary closure permit approved yesterday." The officer's stern expression softened slightly. "Well, everything seems to be in order then." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "For what it's worth, my mother uses a wheelchair too. What happened to your father was wrong." As the police departed without incident, Richard caught sight of Diane Keller watching from the end of the block, phone still in hand. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, getting back into her SUV with stiff movements. "That woman doesn't know when to quit," Carmen muttered. Richard nodded, but found himself feeling something unexpected, a twinge of pity. In her rigid defense of rules and property values, Diane had managed to isolate herself from the very community she claimed to protect. His thoughts were interrupted by Miguel Rodriguez calling for attention. "Everyone, we need to pause the construction for a moment." He gestured toward Eduardo, who was sitting beside Tommy with the blueprints. "Maestro Martinez has a suggestion for an improvement to the design." All eyes turned to Eduardo, who seemed momentarily embarrassed by the attention before his professional demeanor took over. "The current